Why is gold the best money? If you can't explain this to your friends, family, or colleagues, then you need to watch this video and possibly even share it with them. So, a common answer to this question includes the explanation of intrinsic value. A lot of people say that gold is money because of its intrinsic value. You even hear that from experts today. And in this video, one thing I want to do is push back a little bit on that claim. I don't believe that gold is money because of its intrinsic value. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you agree. There is one other property of gold that is extremely important. And again, I'm going to explain what that is. So, before I explain the misconception around intrinsic value, let me just say that a lot of the topics we talk about here today come from my upcoming YouTube series called Hidden Secrets of Value. Specifically, this content comes from episode 3, The 12 Properties of Money. That series is going to drop in October. So, if you want to see it, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss it. So, where does this misconception of intrinsic value come from? Well, it goes back to Aristotle. And he said, money must not only possess value in itself, intrinsic value, but it must be easily transportable. It must also be of a nature that will not perish. We also see a quote from Murray Rothbard. Money is not a useless token only good for exchanging. It must have pre-existing value for uses other than money. Basically, what he means is intrinsic value. And finally, our third quote, money has not been generated by law. In its origin, it is a social and not a state institution arising from the commodities themselves that had intrinsic value. So that's Carl Menger, the founder of the Austrian school itself, and he uses the phrase explicitly intrinsic value. So I don't blame any of these thinkers for thinking about intrinsic value or even making these claims. It is easy to see when we observe so many different monies throughout history that they all had intrinsic value, but they didn't necessarily have to have intrinsic value. So here's what I mean. As we observe so many of the different types of monies throughout history, like feathers, seashells, beads, or gold and silver, we see that they are all physical objects. So, of course, they had intrinsic value. There was something you could do with them. But did they have to have intrinsic value? Well, if we look at some modern forms of money, like fiat paper currencies or anything digital, we realize, of course, those forms of money don't have any intrinsic value at all. So, not only can something arise as money without having intrinsic value, but whenever something has stopped being money in the past, it's never because it lost its intrinsic value, right? Think about feathers. Anything you could do with a feather, you could still do with a feather even after it stops being money. And the same is true of beads and shells and cigarettes and copper. Basically, anything that has been money that had intrinsic value still has the same intrinsic value. It's just no longer money. And there's a very good reason why it stopped being money, which I'm going to explain in the second half of the video. But importantly, we need to understand that something's status as money is unrelated to whether or not it has intrinsic value. So if we want to know why something is the best money, we have to go back to the fundamentals and ask, why does something become money in the first place? An equivalent question here is, what problem does money solve? And the answer is, you want to store your surplus time and energy. So in other words, you don't need to spend your entire day just finding food or shelter. You can only spend part of your day solving those needs. And then with whatever time and energy you have left over, you have a surplus. So how do you store that extra time or energy? Well, that's where money comes in. You gather some objects that represent surplus, and then you can trade them with others. But the problem here is that not all objects are going to store your value in the same way. And so the important question here, because we're concerned with storing our value for the future, is not so much what happened in the past, but what we think is likely to happen moving forward. So our original question here, why is gold the best money, is not best answered by looking at why did gold become money originally, but we have to look at a question, why has gold stayed money? And so for an answer, we can look at other forms of money and ask, why did they stop being money? One perfect example is wampum. We can see here an Indian chief wearing wampum across his chest, these horizontal beads made from clamshells with a hole drilled in the middle. And so wampum served as money for hundreds of years, and various Indian tribes used it to trade with the colonists and with each other. However, One enterprising American, John Campbell, decided to make a factory with a hydraulic wampum drilling machine so he could mass produce wampum in a factory. As you can imagine, when he created wampum way faster than people could manually, that increased the supply of wampum dramatically. And this type of inflation causes one thing to happen: the value of each individual piece of wampum plummets. And so over time, the scarcity of wampum disappeared and wampum lost its value. We saw a very similar thing happen on the Isle of Yap. The islanders quarried giant limestone rocks that were sometimes a few feet or even 10 feet in diameter, and they got this from sailing their tiny wooden canoes hundreds of miles across the Pacific Ocean, quarrying limestone with stone tools and bringing it all the way back to their island. And so this served as money for them for hundreds of years until a more technologically advanced society, the Europeans, came and they used superior ships and superior tools to quarry these limestone rocks way faster. And so they too inflated the supply of rye stones, and that ultimately ruined the value of each stone. And so you and I are actually islanders. We are Native Americans, and we are hand drilling wampum, and we are quarrying limestone rocks. And yes, we have computers and cell phones and different clothing, but we're going through that exact same process of pursuing dollars that we think are scarce. However, there's someone in the economy with superior tools that's creating wampum and rye stones and dollars way faster, and it's totally unfair. That is, of course, the Federal Reserve with their money printer. Money printer go brrr, and they're creating dollars way too fast. And so if you want to protect yourself from having all of your value just disappear, you have to hold something that can't be produced easily by one particular member of the economy. You have to hold the money that has been the best money for thousands of years. You have to hold gold. So why is gold the best money? Because gold has stayed difficult to acquire for thousands of years, and that's relative to everything else on the planet. It's harder to increase the supply of gold than it is the supply of feathers or wampum or rye stones. You just simply can't create gold unless you can invent alchemy, but that's been tried for a very long time and no one has succeeded. So that is why gold is the best money, and that's why everyone on the planet should be holding it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. This is just part of the content that's coming in my upcoming series, Hidden Secrets of Value. This is part of episode 3, and the series is going to drop this October. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss it.